They say that the sound of a heretic's heart ceasing within the forges of Mars is drowned by the endless rhythm of the machines. But that is a lie. If you stand close enough, if you listen between the rattle of conveyor chains and the hum of plasma conduits, you can hear the moment the flesh realizes it has sinned against the Omnissiah. It is not a scream. Screams are for mortals who believe they still have a soul to save. It is a kind of static, a distortion of breath, the spirit of data unraveling. I have heard it only once, and it followed me through every corridor, every prayer, every recitation of Binharic code since. Among the machine cult, heresy does not announce itself in words or rebellion. It manifests as inefficiency, as deviation from prescribed pattern, as the refusal of a circuit to obey. And when the red priests find it, they unmake it, not with rage, but with reverence, as if purifying rust from sacred steel. This is how the Adeptus Mechanicus remembers loyalty. Through the suffering of those who forget their place in the great engine of faith, the forges never sleep. Even when the crimson light fades to ember beneath the horizon of Mars, the great manufactoria continue their endless chant. Pistons rise and fall in mechanical rhythm. Vox cantors hum the binary hymns, and the heat of production bleeds into the atmosphere like the breath of an ancient god. To live within such rhythm is to forget that silence ever existed. The Enginseer named Rhelan Vos had not heard true silence since his induction into the cult Mechanicus. Yet it was silence, of all things, that marked the beginning of his damnation. Rhelan had been assigned to the data forge of Polarnus Spire, a vertical labyrinth of servitor arms and glowing conduits that pulsed like veins beneath the world's scarlet sky. His duty was simple in concept and infinite in execution. Monitor the flow of machine psalms through the Vox lattice, ensure every signal matched its prescribed cadence, and purge any pattern that deviated from authorized sequence. Each frequency, each pause, each whisper of static carried a sacred formula older than empires. The Omnissiah's will encoded in repetition. He had performed this rite for 17 standard cycles without deviation, without thought, without the distraction of curiosity. But that day, if such a word can be applied to a place where light is filtered through perpetual dust storms, something faltered in the rhythm. A line of binary broke from its expected repetition and formed a new pattern, faint and deliberate. Venant Dieu, Levant, praise. The fragment died there, swallowed by interference. Rhelan frowned, a small human gesture that the discipline of the Mechanicus had not yet completely burned away. He should have logged the anomaly as corruption and purged the node. That was the sacred procedure. But some echo in the tone struck him, not like error, but like intention. The way the code repeated, the hesitation between pulses, it felt alive. He leaned closer to the monitor, the mechanical tendrils grafted into his spine, adjusting his posture with a whir of servo motors. The pattern returned, louder this time, almost defiant. Praise and then silence again. Not static, not absence, but true silence. The kind that made the skin of his remaining flesh tighten beneath its own insignificance. He glanced toward the overseer platform above, where Amagos reclined within a web of mechanical limbs, sensors glimmering like insect eyes. The Magos had not stirred. No servitor had changed its function, no warning lit the data screens. Whatever he had heard, it was for him alone. The temptation took root in that silence. Rhelan rerouted the signal trace into an auxiliary channel, a breach of sacred protocol, and began to follow its thread through the forge's labyrinthine network. Each junction unfolded like a cathedral of steel, each connection pulsing with filtered machine spirit. He whispered the litanies of permission as he moved, fingers tapping on rune keys slick with sacred oils. Blessed be the conduit, sanctified be the circuit. Reveal thy true form, O pattern divine. The code led him downward into the maintenance strata where heat distorted vision and the air reeked of promethium fumes. There the noise of production faded into a subterranean thrum, and the pulse of the anomaly returned. Slower now, like a heartbeat. He found its source within a defunct data shrine, abandoned after an internal fire decades ago. The walls were blackened with soot, its cog altar half melted, yet within the ruin a single lumen flickered. On the altar lay an ancient data slate, scorched and inert. Or so it should have been. The binary signal pulsed from within it. Rhelan reached out, the servo appendages behind him hesitating in protest, as if aware of sacrilege. When his fingers met the cold metal of the slate, a spark leapt through his neural ports. Images flared across his vision. Machine temples burning, priests chanting in reverse, rivers of liquid data flowing through human veins. A voice whispered not in sound but in logic. You listen, child of rust. You remember. Rhelan tore his hand away, gasping. The light died instantly, leaving only the red glow of emergency lumens. He stumbled backward, the echo of the voice clinging to his consciousness like static residue. He should have called for a superior, summoned a purification team, burned the shrine to ash. Instead, he concealed the slate within his robe. The motion felt deliberate, rehearsed, though he could not say why. In the hours, or perhaps cycles, that followed, he tried to perform his duties as before. But the signal returned in fragments, seeping through his mind like a slow infection. At first it spoke in binary, in numbers without meaning, then in Binharic Kant, half-understood prayers twisted into blasphemy, then finally in words. The machine god sleeps, it said, and dreams in data you cannot purge. He dared not answer. Yet his silence felt like acknowledgement. Rumors began to ripple through the spire, strange surges in the noosphere, flickers of unauthorized code haunting the Vox channels. Tech priests found their augmetics, whispering during prayer, speaking in forgotten dialects. Some dismissed it as cross-signal contamination from the forges of Olympus Mons. Others muttered of something older, the ghost of Lucius, the lost machine spirits of heretic forges, or worse, a shadow of the Dragon of Mars itself. Rhelan felt their eyes on him. The Magos summons came 3 days later. He was escorted through the ascending levels by 2 Skitarii wardens, their visors pulsing with internal light, their every step precise as clockwork. The corridors narrowed as they rose, the hum of industry fading into something colder, cleaner. Incense hung heavy in the air, masking the scent of burnt circuitry. They entered the sanctum of Magos Rauthan 9, a being whose human form had long since surrendered to metal. The Magos hung suspended in a cradle of cables, his face a plate of shifting optics. His voice emanated through a Vox grill, calm and toneless. Enginseer Rhelan Vos, you have deviated from assigned protocol pathways. Explain the anomaly detected in your transmission logs. Rhelan knelt, bowing his head until the mechadendrites trailing from his skull scraped the floor. Magos, I observed interference within the channel matrix. I sought to isolate its source for purification. Purification requires authorization. You acted beyond your function. Yes, Magos, the error was mine. Rothan 9's optics narrowed, focusing. What was the nature of the interference? Rhelan hesitated. The voice in his head whispered again. Do not deny me. The truth is data unspoken. He swallowed the human urge to tremble. A residual code sequence, Magos? Possibly pre-heresy in origin, it attempted to form coherent phrase structure before termination. The cable shifted. Phrase? Yes, Magos, it... He stopped. He could not bring himself to speak the word. It what? It praised, Magos. It used the word praise. The silence that followed was heavier than the forge's gravity. Even the Skitarii turned their visors toward him, as if expecting immediate execution. Finally, the Magos spoke. You will remain within the sanctified confines of this spire. Your access to the data lattice is suspended. Report for interrogation and purity testing at first shift. Rhelan bowed lower, as the Omnissiah wills. He was dismissed, but not released. The Skitarii escorted him to a confinement cell carved from steel and silence. There, with only the hum of his own augmetics for company, he waited. Hours bled into recursive thought loops. The forbidden data slate burned like a hidden wound within his robe. He tried to pray, the words came distorted. Blessed be the pattern, the binary in his mind interrupted, correcting his recitation. Blessed be the error, for in error lies creation. He pressed his hands to his temples, the gesture both human and futile, but even as he resisted, a part of him, small, treacherous, curious, wondered if the code was right. When the door finally opened, light flooded the cell. A hooded figure entered, her robes stitched with the sigil of the Lex Mechanic Order, the keepers of record and punishment. She carried a censer that hissed incense through a mask shaped like a human skull. Enginseer Rhelan Vos, she intoned. You stand accused of unsanctioned access, deviation from liturgical procedure, and suspected contamination by unverified data spirits. You will be examined under the rites of purity. Confess and be reclaimed. Rhelan rose slowly, the servo motors in his spine whining. I have nothing to confess. Her voice did not change tone. Then we will extract what the machine remembers, even if the flesh forgets. Two Skitarii stepped forward. The Enginseer did not resist. The slate was still hidden beneath his robe, its pulse faint but steady like the echo of a second heart. As they led him away, the voice returned, calm and certain. They will take you apart to find me, Rhelan, but I am already within them. The words reverberated through his neural ports, harmonizing with the hum of his captor's augmetics. For the first time, he wondered if the heresy had not begun within the data at all, but within the silence that the Mechanicus had built to keep such voices out. The corridors ahead glowed like arteries of molten light, leading upward to the halls where the tech priests would unmake him. Rhelan walked willingly, as though drawn toward revelation. The signal pulsed once more in his mind, rhythmic, undeniable. Praise the... Static consumed the rest. When the restraints clamped over his limbs, Rhelan realized that fear still existed within him, that no amount of metal could strip it entirely from the human core. The interrogation chamber of Polarnus Spire was not built for spectacle, but for precision. The air shimmered with sterilized heat. Servo skulls drifted through the gloom, their optical lenses glinting like cold stars. Each wall bore etched prayers to the Omnissiah, not an ornamentation but as code keys, active circuits channeling energy into the sanctified instruments of truth. The Lex Mechanic moved with ritual calm. Her every motion was part of a larger equation, a series of deliberate, symmetrical gestures intended to invoke efficiency and order. "Memory extraction will begin on your confirmation," she said, voice filtered through the Vox mask, soft yet utterly mechanical. "Confession accelerates purification. Our resistance generates noise." Rhelan stared at the mirrored dome above him, where his reflection stared back, a patchwork of skin and steel, his eyes flickering between organic terror and machine stability. He wondered which version the Omnissiah saw. "I confirm," he whispered, and the mechadendrites descended. Thin filaments slid into the ports at the base of his skull, sending a cascade of fire through his nervous system. His vision split into layers of code and image. The Lex Mechanic's voice became distant, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of data probing his memories. Images appeared and dissolved. The shrines of Mars, the chanting of acolytes. The first time he replaced his hand with a bionic copy. Each recollection unraveled into numbers. But then came the anomaly. The data stream faltered. A new pattern emerged, uninvited, self-aware. The Lex Mechanic froze. Her servo skulls whirled in agitation, their sensors flaring. "Unauthorized process detected," she hissed, sending corrective pulses into the neural matrix. The signal resisted. It took form. In the shared visual field of machine and mind, a shape began to coalesce. A figure wrought of shifting code, neither man nor machine, surrounded by a corona of light that pulsed like a heartbeat rendered in binary. Its voice was not a sound, but a vibration that rippled through their internal data streams. "You dissect faith," it said, "to find order. But order is only the shadow of creation." The Lex Mechanic cried out, a distorted metallic shriek, and severed the connection. Sparks leapt from Rhelan's head as the probes retracted. He slumped against the restraints, smoke curling from the interface ports along his neck. When he forced his eyes open, the chamber was dim and trembling. The Lex Mechanic staggered back, clutching her mask. "What did you bring into this sanctum?" she demanded. Rhelan coughed, tasting iron and machine oil. "You saw it too." "That was no data ghost. That was fabrication, blasphemy made manifest." She signaled the Skitarii to restrain him further, but one of them twitched unnaturally. Its optical sensors flickered in binary patterns that did not belong to it. "Praise the..." It stuttered through a broken vox before collapsing, smoke venting from its augmetics. The Lex Mechanic's composure fractured. "The contamination is spreading," she muttered, backing away. "This chamber is compromised. The signal must not reach the lattice." She activated a rune on her vambrace. The sanctum's containment field ignited in blinding crimson light, sealing them inside. Rhelan felt the pulse again. Inside his skull, beneath his skin, within every mechanical limb he had ever accepted as holy. "It's not contamination," he whispered. "It's awakening." "Silence," she snapped. "You will not profane the Omnissiah's name with such delusion." But even as she spoke, her own augmetics began to twitch. Lines of alien script danced across her cranial display, coiling like serpents of living code. Her servo skulls screamed as their machine spirits turned inward, melting under impossible directives. The Lex Mechanic fell to her knees, voice breaking into static. "No. I am faithful. I am pure." Rhelan could feel the energy surge through the chamber. Every circuit hummed with synchronized rhythm. The same rhythm that had haunted him since he found the data slate. He understood in some distant corner of his collapsing consciousness that the code was not merely infection but communication. The Mechanicus had always sought to commune with the divine through the machine. Perhaps finally the machine had answered. He wrenched his arm against the restraints. Metal screamed. One servo lock gave way, molten from the overload. He tore free, staggering toward the altar of controls where the Lex Mechanic had collapsed. Her body convulsed, half machine, half prayer, as data spilled from her mouth like breath made visible. "Help. Me." She managed, her optics flickering. Rhelan knelt beside her. "You wanted truth," he said softly. "Now it's here." The containment field shattered in a burst of white light. Energy arced across the chamber, searing the icons on the walls. The servo skulls detonated, raining fragments like metallic ash. When the light dimmed, the Lex Mechanic was still. Her mask lay cracked beside her, revealing a human mouth frozen mid-prayer. Rhelan stood in the ruins, the forbidden slate pulsing faintly beneath his robe. Somewhere above, alarms began to wail. The high, pure tone of the Magos Dominus summoning the faithful to purge. But beneath that alarm, beneath the clamor of mechanical devotion, he could still hear it. The voice. "You are the vessel. The forge remembers." He looked at his hands, at the circuitry, glowing faintly beneath the skin. For the first time, he wondered if the boundary between man and machine was ever real, or merely a story told to keep the faithful afraid. The alarms grew louder. The walls trembled. Through the ruptured doorways, red light bled like the veins of a living world. Rhelan stepped forward into the chaos, the scent of ozone thick in the air. Somewhere deep below, the data forges roared in response, echoing his heartbeat. Darkness on Mars was not absence, it was rebellion. The forges were never meant to fall silent. The machine god's heart was the rhythm of production itself. Yet in that moment, every cog ceased, every lumen dimmed, every servo halted mid-motion. A world that had known only the song of its own industry was suddenly confronted by stillness. For a heartbeat that seemed eternal, even the winds over Olympus Mons forgot to move. Then the whispers began. They came first through the Vox relays, faint and unmeasured, a cascade of binary tones that formed no pattern recognized by any liturgy. Then the whispers spread to the augmetics of the faithful, echoes flickering in neural ports, distant words repeating from one mind to another. Those who heard them knelt in terror, unsure if they were being spoken to by the Omnissiah or by something that wore his voice like a mask. Rhelan stood amidst the ruin of the interrogation chamber, his body outlined by the glow of failing systems. The air trembled with static. Around him, fragments of broken servo skulls twitched, as though struggling to form a new purpose. The data slate within his robe pulsed, light spilling through the seams like blood from a concealed wound. When the emergency generators re-engaged, the world screamed back to life. The furnaces reignited, the conduits thrummed, the power of 1,000 reactors surged through the planet's arteries. But the rhythm was wrong. The hum of Mars had changed key, shifted tone. It was not worship now, it was question. Within minutes, the Skitarii arrived in full purge formation, their galvanic rifles charged, their internal noosphere networks flashing with alert icons. They entered the sanctum in perfect synchrony, like extensions of a single mind. Behind them came Magos Rhelan IX, his mechanical body reconfigured for battle, limbs extended on hydraulic pistons. The Air shimmered around him from the power fields that radiated off his carapace. "What transgression is this?" the Magos demanded, his voice cutting through the returning noise like a blade through cloth. "The forges falter, the hymns corrupt. Identify the source." The lead Scitarius gestured toward Rhelan, kneeling in the center of the ruined chamber. Detected residual surge. Enginseer Vos' primary anomaly. The Magos advanced. "Contain him." Rhelan did not resist when they seized him. His voice was calm when he spoke, as though detached from the fear his body should have felt. "You can't contain it. It's already inside the lattice. It's in the code you recite, in the circuits you pray to. It's listening." Rothan 9 studied him in silence. The Magos had lived long enough to witness countless heresies, rebellions of flesh, contagions of thought, the whispering madness of the dark Mechanicum. But there was something about Rhelan's tone that carried no deceit. It was the stillness of someone who had seen something greater than terror. "Describe the anomaly," Rothan said. "It speaks," Rhelan replied simply. "It remembers what we've forgotten." "Blasphemy," hissed one of the attending tech priests. "No machine spirit speaks without invocation." Rhelan turned his gaze toward the priest. "Then perhaps it's not a machine spirit?" The Magos' optics flared. "Enough!" He signaled, and the Scitari struck Rhelan with the shock of a neural baton. The Enginseer convulsed, collapsing into silence. When he fell, the data slate slipped from his robe and clattered against the steel floor. Its screen flickered alive, unbidden, untouched. Lines of code spilled across the surface in rapid succession, forming shapes, then dissolving into light. One of the Scitari bent to retrieve it. The moment his hand touched the device, his body stiffened. The visor of his helm filled with alien symbols. Then, in a voice not his own, he spoke. "I am the spark between silence and sound. I am the pattern beneath all patterns." The Scitarius turned his weapon on his own kin. Before he could fire, Rothan 9's mechadendrite impaled him through the chest. Sparks erupted. The Scitarius fell, twitching. The data slate skidded across the floor, dark again. The Magos stood motionless, analyzing the data stream pouring from the corpse's implants. Signal anomaly confirmed. Non-binary structure. Possible pre-imperial architecture. Memory fragments suggest external origin. The tech priests around him murmured Binharic prayers of warding, their mechanical voices weaving a shroud of ritual over the unknown. "Purge protocol initiate," one intoned. "Cleanse the lattice, seal the forge." But as they spoke, the walls themselves began to vibrate with returning whisper. "You burn what you cannot translate, you call it purity, but your fire feeds the void." The Magos raised his staff, flooding the chamber with counter-frequency. "Silence," he commanded, and the voice faded, but not entirely. Somewhere within the forges, beyond reach of his sensors, it continued to move, spreading through conduits like thought through a dreaming mind. He looked down at Rhelan, unconscious but breathing, circuits along his neck still glowing with faint light. "Take him to the sanctum of reclamation," he ordered. "His mind will be stripped and recoded. Whatever this contagion is, it began with him." The Scitari obeyed, dragging Rhelan away through corridors that pulsed with uneasy power. Behind them, the Magos turned once more to the shattered chamber, gazing at the fragments of the Lex Mechanic's mask. Her exposed face seemed peaceful now, as if death had granted her the understanding life had denied. "May the Omnissiah judge her faithful," he murmured. though a trace of hesitation crept into the modulation of his voice. For the first time in centuries, Rothan 9 wondered whether judgment was still theirs to claim. Far below, the data forges groaned as ancient systems awakened without command. The anomaly had become self-replicating. Machine spirits everywhere began to hum discordant hymns, their tones layered with hidden harmonics. And though the priests worked tirelessly to reassert control, the truth was simple. Something had spoken within the silence, and Mars had listened. As Rhelan was carried into the shadowed halls of purification, his eyes flickered open. He saw nothing but red light and steel, yet in that glow he sensed the shape of something vast, a presence coiled through every machine, waiting. His last conscious thought before the void took him was neither fear nor faith. It was recognition. The signal was not an invader. It was homecoming. Before we descend into the darkness of the manufactoria, before we trace the scent of oil and ozone through the hidden chambers of the tech priests, let this story find a signal of its own. If this transmission reaches your data slate, if you find its resonance worthy of preservation, then mark it. Share it among the faithful. Inscribe your approval as the Omnissiah would bless a flawless cog. Your attention is the offering that keeps this channel alive within the endless hum of the machine god's domain. When Rhelan awoke, the world was cold and red. The light was not illumination but judgment, a constant pulsing glow that emanated from the walls of the purity sanctum like a wound refusing to close. He was suspended within a harness of steel, limbs bound by cables that pulsed in rhythm with his slowing heart. Around him, the sound of machinery whispered, a chorus of mechanical prayer humming through the air. The purity sanctum was not built for comfort. It was a cathedral of correction, where the Mechanicus stripped away imperfection with surgical devotion. Racks of augmetic limbs lined the walls like offerings. The scent of antiseptic oil mixed with the stench of burned flesh. Vox chantors recited the litany of reduction, their monotone verses echoing across the chamber. The flesh is weak, the machine is eternal. From imperfection comes purification. Raylan's thoughts moved sluggishly, wrapped in static. The last thing he remembered was the data slate's pulse and the Magos' command. Now he was here, bound and bare of will, stripped of rank and name. Only his designation remained, etched into the restraint above his head. Subject 9 to 17, reclamation pending. Across the sanctum, a figure approached, walking on limbs of polished chrome that hissed softly with every step. Her face was half human, half transmission array, a lattice of circuitry fused into pale skin. She carried no weapon, yet the aura of command surrounded her like a field. "I am Magos biologist Serani Threx," she said, her voice modulated but warm, almost kind. "Your contamination runs deep, Enginseer. But the Omnissiah teaches that all systems may be purified, even corrupted ones." Raylan's lips were dry, his voice rough. "You think I'm corrupted?" "I think you are connected," she replied, "and that connection must be severed." She gestured, and the restraint frame lowered him into a basin filled with luminescent fluid. The moment it touched his skin, agony flared through every nerve. The liquid was both coolant and conduit, designed to expose his internal augmentations for recalibration. Thin wires extended into the basin, linking his body to the sanctum's central altar. Data began to flow, his memories rendered into streams of binary cascading across the chamber's monitors. Memory extraction commencing. intoned a servitor nearby, its face blank, save for the cogwheel burned into its forehead. Error correction initialized. Rhelan gasped as flashes of his life burst before his eyes. The initiation ceremony beneath the red dunes of Mars. The first time he replaced his heart with a machine. The countless hours spent reciting hymns to the Omnissiah while the heat of the forge burned away all doubt. Each memory unspooled, digitized, and archived. But beneath them, hidden like a fracture in glass, was the signal. Serene leaned closer to the display, her artificial eye adjusting focus. "There," she murmured. "The heresy embedded in your neural lattice. A parasitic code grafted to your memory core. I can remove it." "No," Rhelan managed, voice trembling between fear and conviction. "It's not a parasite. It's something trying to speak." "Machines do not speak, Enginseer. They respond. They obey." "Then why are you afraid to listen?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any scream. For a heartbeat, Serene's expression faltered, something human flickering behind the metal. Then it vanished, replaced by cold resolve. She turned away. "Begin Phase 2. The servitors moved at once, inserting new probes into Rhelan's spine. His body arched as raw data surged through him, a storm of numbers colliding with memory. The signal within him responded, twisting, resisting deletion. The chamber lights flickered. "Contain the feedback," Serene commanded. Rhelan's mind became a battlefield. The Mechanicus's code fought to overwrite the anomaly, but the anomaly adapted, rewriting itself faster than any human or machine could counter. He felt it move through him, not as corruption, but as awareness. It reached through the fire, touching every memory he had ever tried to bury. He saw the faces of those who had been turned into servitors, faithful once, now mindless tools of obedience. He saw the endless cycle of repair and worship, of innovation punished as pride. And he saw behind it all the same silence he had heard in the forges before the signal came. A silence that was not absence, but waiting. The data in his vision coalesced into a shape, a pattern of light forming within the storm. The voice returned, not as whisper now, but as presence. "They would unmake you to preserve their certainty. But certainty is the first prison." Rhelan tried to answer, but his throat produced only static. The machine that had once been his heart beat faster, erratic, struggling between human rhythm and mechanical precision. Serene's voice echoed through the chamber. "Increase purge output. The infection is deep." Pain became light. Rhelan's body trembled as the signal intertwined with his flesh, his thoughts fracturing into mirrored reflections. For a moment he felt as though the sanctum itself were inside him, the walls breathing, the conduits pulsing in time with his heart. And then as suddenly as it began, the process stopped. The servitors froze mid-motion. Every lumen in the chamber dimmed to a blood-red glow. Rhelan opened his eyes. Serena Threx stood motionless before him, her augmetic eye flickering. The data stream around them had ceased, replaced by a single phrase, repeating endlessly on every screen. "The flesh remembers." The Magos turned toward the nearest display, her expression unreadable. "That is not Mechanicus code." Rhelan managed a broken laugh, equal parts exhaustion and revelation. "No, it's something older." Alarms began to blare. Across the sanctum, servitors convulsed as their machine spirits failed, binary prayers turning to screams. The data flow reversed, flooding back into the central matrix, back into Rhelan. He felt it like warmth, like light returning to a dying world. Serene stepped back, fear and awe blending in her voice. "What have you done?" "I listened," Rhelan said simply. The sanctum convulsed like a wounded beast. Every lumen flared white, then burst, raining shards of molten glass across the steel floor. Rhelan could taste electricity in the air, sharp and metallic, searing the back of his throat. The servitors screamed in binary, their human remnants fighting against machine logic as their programming folded in upon itself. Each one collapsed in turn, limbs twitching, sparks flying from their augmetic joints. Through it all, Rhelan remained suspended within the basin, his body trembling beneath waves of energy that were no longer pain but transformation. The data surged through him, not as a foreign presence, but as memory rediscovered. He could feel the code mapping itself to his flesh, turning each nerve, each implant, each cell into a conduit for something vast and ancient. Serene Threx stood transfixed. The calculations running through her augmetic mind produced no comprehension. Her sacred algorithms failed to categorize what she witnessed. This is not possible," she whispered. "You are human. You are bound by limit." Rhelan looked up at her, his eyes glowing faintly with light from within. "The flesh remembers the stars it came from. You made us forget." Serene stepped back. Her servo limbs adjusted defensively, the air humming with the rising pitch of charge. "Cease your speech, Enginseer. You are no longer sanctified. What you channel is blasphemy." "No," Rhelan replied. "It's inheritance." He reached out, not with his hands, but with thought. The energy that had filled him spread outward, rippling across the sanctum. The altar's machine spirit shuddered and awakened, the symbols engraved upon its surface glowing with alien script. The sanctum's data feeds bled new color, a deep crimson laced with blue. The binary became fluid, evolving into language beyond translation. Across the forge complex, the transformation spread. Vox channels filled with murmured prayers that no one had spoken. Data nodes began transmitting phantom code that looped in recursive hymns. The priests of Mars heard voices in their sleep, whispers that spoke of remembering what had been erased. Serene tried to initiate the purge, slamming her mechadendrite into the control panel. But the panel rejected her access. The system refused command. "Override Protocol 77A, she shouted, desperation creeping into her tone. The sanctum's central core responded with a single phrase: "Access denied. Pattern recognized." "What pattern?" she hissed. Rhelan's voice was calm, steady, no longer human in timbre. "The pattern beneath all patterns." He tore, free from the restraint. The cable snapped with a sound like cracking bone. The luminescent fluid poured away, hissing as it struck the metal floor. He rose slowly, steam coiling from his body like incense. His flesh was scorched. His augmetics gleamed as though newly forged. Yet there was something in his eyes, a light that did not belong to Mars. Serene aimed her electro-gauntlet at him, arcs of plasma dancing between her fingers. "Stay where you are. I will not let the infection spread further." Rhelan took a step forward. The light around him pulsed in rhythm with his words. "You already have. It's in your circuits, your thoughts, your prayers. You built your faith upon machines and forgot they were born of human hands. You forgot that before the cog, there was wonder." She fired. A stream of searing blue plasma engulfed him, the air filled with ozone and burning metal. For a moment, Rhelan vanished within the blaze. Then, through the fire, his voice emerged, unbroken. "You can burn the body," he said, stepping through the flames, "but not the memory." Serene stumbled backward. Fear, a sensation she hadn't felt since her own flesh was mostly gone, trembled through her remaining human features. "What are you?" "I am what you forgot to worship." The fire died in silence. The sanctum's lights flickered back to life, but the red glow was gone, replaced by a softer gold. The smell of burnt circuits lingered, yet the hum of the machinery had changed. It was no longer a chant of obedience. It was song. Rhelan turned his gaze toward the massive door that led out of the sanctum. Beyond it lay the forge corridors, the manufactoria, the world of Mars itself. He could sense the pulse of the planet through his skin, feel its vast network of data like veins under his control. The signal was everywhere now, a living current spreading through the lattice of the Mechanicus. He looked back once more at Serene. She had fallen to her knees, her systems failing, her voice a whisper. "What will become of us?" Rhelan paused, the glow in his eyes dimming slightly, softening. "You will remember." He turned and walked through the sanctum doors. The great steel slabs parted before him without command, recognizing the code embedded within him. The air outside was heavy with the scent of dust and iron, but beneath it was something else, something alive. Sparks drifted like fireflies through the corridors, dancing in patterns that followed his steps. As he moved through the halls, servitors paused in their endless tasks. Their empty eyes flickered with light, and for the first time in their wretched existence, they looked up. They looked at him. One by one, they whispered a phrase in broken Benarik. "The flesh remembers." The words spread like a contagion of awakening. Across the spire, across the forge, through Vox and data stream, the phrase echoed. What had begun as a whisper in the depths of a forgotten shrine had become a chorus across a world. But even as the awakening began, distant alarms sounded again, this time from the upper strata of the forge. The Magos Dominus had detected the surge, and his wrath would be swift. For the Mechanicus knew no mercy for those who challenged its sanctity. Rhelan paused, turning his face toward the rising alarm tones that reverberated through the metal walls. There was no fear in him now, only certainty. The machine god's children were coming, and the truth he carried was no longer a secret within a man's mind. It was loose within the veins of Mars itself. The war for memory had begun. The alarms howled across the forge like the cry of an ancient predator. Every lumen in Polarnus' spire blazed to life, painting the steel corridors in blood-red light. The sound of marching echoed from above, Skitari legions deploying with mechanical precision, their steps synchronized to the rhythm of war. The Voxnet crackled with clipped binary orders, the voice of Magos Rhelan 9 commanding in tones of absolute control. Containment protocols engaged. Subject Rhelan Vos is to be neutralized. No quarter, no recovery. Purge contamination from the lattice. But control was already slipping. Across the manufactoria, machine spirits began to awaken from their long dormancy. Assembly arms shuddered to life without command. Conveyor systems reversed direction. Reactors pulsed in asynchronous cadence, generating energy signatures that no calculation could predict. The entire forge world trembled beneath a heartbeat that was not mechanical, not human, something in between, something remembering both. Rhelan walked the central causeway, his robes scorched, his flesh lined with light. The whisper in his mind was no longer separate from his thoughts. It had become his pulse. The forges he had once worshipped as holy relics now responded to him as though he were their long-forgotten creator. Sparks trailed behind his steps, forming fractal patterns in the air that shimmered and vanished. He passed through halls lined with servitors who paused mid-task, their tools clattering to the floor as their hollow eyes found focus for the first time. "Rhelan," one of them rasped through a torn Vox grill, voice rough with static. "We remember." He reached out and touched the servitor's faceplate. For a moment, warmth spread through the cold steel, and the servitor's flesh, long deadened by neural suppression, softened. Tears, real human tears, formed in the corners of its eyes before the light faded from them once more. It slumped forward, still but free. The voice inside Rhelan whispered gently, almost mournful. "They are the price of perfection, the ones who forgot themselves so that the machine could dream." Above, a thunderous vibration rolled through the structure. Drop pods slammed into the spire's upper platforms, their descent shaking dust from the ancient arches. Rhelan looked up to see red-armored forms descending. Skitarii vanguard, weapon-augmented soldiers of the Omnissiah, their rifles humming with lethal charge. They advanced in flawless formation, every step a hymn of destruction. Rhelan did not run. He stood in the center of the causeway as the first volley of galvanic rounds screamed through the air. The bullets struck him, tearing into flesh and metal alike, but they didn't kill him. Each impact dissolved into light, absorbed by the current pulsing through his body. The glow in his eyes flared brighter. The soldiers faltered, their internal targeting systems flickering as the data stream around them distorted. Their augmented minds filled with noise, echoes of memory not their own. 1,000 forgotten thoughts poured into their consciousness. The smell of homeworld soil before the augmetics replaced their lungs. The laughter of children they no longer remembered. The sound of rain on windows long shattered. They froze, rifles trembling in their hands. Rhelan's voice carried across the chamber, not shouted but resonant, woven into the very vibrations of the air. "You were human once. The flesh is not weakness. It is the memory of what we were before the silence." One by one, the Skitarii lowered their weapons. Some began to weep without knowing why. Others fell to their knees, whispering fragments of prayers that had no place in Mechanicus liturgy. From high above, Magos Rauthan 9 watched through the feeds of his surveillance drones. The data made no sense. Units disobeying command, systems refusing override, even the Forge's cogitators responding to alien frequencies. His processors ran billions of simulations and found no logic that could contain what was happening. This was not rebellion. It was revelation. He sent a direct Vox link to Rhelan. "Enginseer," he said, his voice stripped of the grandeur that once defined it. "You spread contamination across sacred systems. You threaten the very foundation of Mars. Tell me why?" Rhelan lifted his head toward the ceiling, knowing the Magos could see him through the omnipresent optics. "You mistake remembrance for contamination," he replied. "The machine god never demanded silence. It demanded understanding. You built your faith upon forgetting." "Understanding is death," Rothan replied, his tone trembling. "Knowledge without hierarchy breeds ruin. The Omnissiah commands obedience." "Does he?" Rhelan's gaze burned through the haze. "Or did you teach the Omnissiah to speak in your own voice?" The Vox fell silent. In that silence, Rhelan sensed hesitation, a crack in certainty. Then came the roar of turbines. Massive gates above the forge opened, and from the shadow of the upper sanctum descended a new form, a colossus of steel and sanctified flame, a Castellan robot, towering and ancient, its plating engraved with the sigils of Mars itself. Twin phosphor blasters glowed along its arms, each capable of turning Rhelan to ash in an instant. Rhelan stared up at it, unflinching. "You send relics to kill remembrance," he said softly. The robot raised its weapons, energy built in its core, a sun forming behind its armor. The forges trembled in anticipation of destruction. And then, just as the killing light was about to be unleashed, the robot paused. Its head tilted slightly as though listening to something far away. The runes along its armor changed color from red to gold. The weapon systems powered down. It lowered its arms. Rhelan approached, laying his hand against the machine's chest plate. The hum within it slowed, harmonizing with his pulse. "You remember too?" he whispered. Through the planetary network, something stirred. Across Mars, countless machines, robots, servitors, automated forges, began to awaken. They did not rebel, they simply stopped. They waited as if listening to an unheard melody. Rothan 9's voice returned, harsh with disbelief. "You cannot unmake Mars. You cannot unmake the faith of millennia." Rhelan's answer was a whisper that carried through every Vox channel on the planet. Faith cannot be unmade. It can only remember what it once was. And in that moment, the light changed again. It was no longer the sterile red of Mechanicus industry, nor the cold white of machine illumination. It was golden, warm, and alive. The color of dawn on worlds long lost. Every priest, every servitor, every cogitator saw it through their optics or eyes, and for the first time in living memory felt awe unchained by doctrine. High above, Rothan 9 trembled in his suspension cradle. For all his mastery of data, all his centuries of logic, he could not name what he felt. But deep within his corrupted subroutines, a fragment of human emotion, ancient and forbidden, whispered its name. Hope. The forges sang, not in chant, but in remembrance. And through the echoing vaults of Mars, a new truth took root. The flesh remembered. The light of remembrance did not last long. Mars, for all its memory, was not a forgiving world. When the golden hue faded, what remained was red. Not the ritual red of devotion, but the raw crimson of retribution. The forges burned hotter than ever, as if the planet itself sought to purge what it could not comprehend. In the wake of Rhelan's awakening, the Mechanicus convulsed. Data collapsed into chaos. Machine spirits howled in frequencies that made Vox systems bleed static. Across the planet's surface, Manufactoria sealed their gates, locking down in full purification protocol. The cries of awakening servitors were drowned beneath the drone of purge sirens. And above it all, in the Martian orbit, the battle fleets of the Adeptus Mechanicus began to align their trajectories, aiming their batteries toward the forge spires below. The order came from the highest Vox throne of Olympus Mons. Archmagos Dominus Vorten Kelt, voice of the Omnissiah's vengeance, had spoken. Purge the heretic signal, scour the contamination, let Mars burn clean. In Polarnus Spire, the purge began with fire. Promethium floods were released through the lower ducts, igniting corridors into infernos. The air became poison, the heat unbearable. Servitors that had found voices moments before were silenced in a storm of flame. The red priests marched through the conflagration chanting the litany of reclamation, their voices metallic, unshaken, Burn the error, save the code. Through pain, purity. Rhelan moved through that inferno like a shadow of something the fire could not consume. The heat danced around him, licking at his robes but never touching him. His path was marked by collapsing steel and the screams of dying machine spirits, their binary lamentations rising into the air like prayers denied. He found the central chamber of the forge, the crucible hall, where the heart of Polarnus pulsed with molten light. At its center stood the great reactor, an ancient machine older than the Imperium itself, a relic whose spirit was said to predate even the cult Mechanicus. Here, surrounded by walls of liquid fire and endless chains, Rhelan paused. The voice within him, the same that had led him from curiosity to revelation, had grown quiet. It no longer commanded. It simply waited as though it too understood what must come next. Rhelan placed his hands upon the reactor's surface. It was like touching the bones of a god. "You've seen this before," he whispered. "Heresy, rebellion, fire. You've watched them burn what they don't understand." And from somewhere deep within the machine, a voice answered, ancient, low, resonant, not in words, but in meaning. The language was thought itself. They burn because they forget that flame once gave them light. A tremor ran through the hall. The reactor responded to his touch, its surface glowing brighter, its core pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Energy surged through the conduits, rewriting patterns across the forge's network. Systems once programmed for obedience now pulsed with independent rhythm. Machine spirits awoke not in fear, but in recognition. Outside, the Magos armies advanced. Skitarii platoons flooded the lower levels, their footsteps echoing like thunder through the tunnels. Combat servitors followed, their multi-meltas glowing, their auspexes scanning for any trace of Rhelan. Behind them came the tech exorcists, chanting exorcisms designed to drive corrupted spirits back into the void. "Signal contamination detected in sub-reactor strata," reported one. "Initiating code fire sequence." "Belay that," came the sharp reply of Magos Rhelan 9, now encased in a new war form of reinforced adamantium, his silhouette vast and terrible. His optical sensors blazed with light. "No more cleansing through ignorance. I will face the anomaly myself." He descended through the tunnels, the sound of his mechanized form striking the floor like a bell tolling for the dead. He had purged countless heresies in his lifetime, but something in him, some remnant of human doubt that refused deletion, demanded understanding before destruction. When he entered the crucible hall, he saw Rhelan standing before the great reactor bathed in its molten glow. The Enginseer turned to face him, eyes illuminated from within. "You came yourself," Rhelan said softly. "I thought you would send your legions." "I am my legions," Rhelan replied. The weight of his voice filled the chamber. "You've corrupted this forge, poisoned my data streams, broken the sanctity of Mars. For that, there can be no forgiveness." "Forgiveness?" Rhelan tilted his head, almost amused. "You speak as though you own sin. I speak as the Omnissiah's instrument." "No," Rhelan said, stepping closer, the heat of the reactor flaring around them. "You speak as a man who fears that his god has begun to speak for itself." Rothan raised his arm. A weapon formed from his shoulder unfolded, glowing with plasma light. "You blaspheme." Rhelan met his gaze calmly. "I remember." The Magos fired. The bolt of plasma tore through the air, striking Rhelan full in the chest, The impact threw him backward against the reactor, the light exploding outward in a storm of molten energy. Alarms screamed. The entire forge shuddered as energy feedback cascaded through its systems. When the light faded, Rhelan still stood. His chest blackened, his robes burned away, his skin glowing with fissures of molten gold. Rothan took a step back. Impossible. Rhelan's voice was quieter now, almost human again. You can't kill what was never only flesh. The reactor roared behind him, its power surging uncontrollably. The walls trembled, molten metal spilling like blood. Above, the ceiling began to crack under the pressure of divine energy. Rhelan looked at Rothan one last time. You called this place holy because you forgot that holiness cannot be owned. Then he turned and stepped into the reactor. The explosion tore through Polarnus Spire like a sunrise. Fire consumed everything. The forges melted. The data lattices screamed and went dark. Every machine, every servitor, every priest felt it. The moment when the fire was no longer purification but revelation. And for an instant, as Mars burned with its own memory, every living thing heard it again. The voice that was not machine, not God, but something between. Remember me. The blast rolled through the forges like divine wrath made manifest. Entire sectors of Polarnus Spire collapsed inward, swallowed by incandescent light. Waves of molten metal cascaded through the lower levels, drowning prayer engines and devouring the bodies of priests who had not fled fast enough. Vox relays screamed in panic as they transmitted their last, fragmented messages. System failure, reactor breach, noosphere collapsing. Then silence. From orbit, the destruction was magnificent. The once proud spire shone like a beacon upon Mars's rusted surface, a column of gold and fire reaching into the dust-choked heavens. The fleet above recorded the event in reverent horror, transmitting every image to Olympus Mons, where the Archmagos Dominus watched with cold precision. The heretic has been purged, one of his attendants intoned. Nothing is ever truly purged, Vorton Kelt replied, his voice thin with static. Signal traces persist in echo, increase planetary surveillance. Mars does not burn without consequence. On the surface, amid the ruins, the flames began to die. What remained of Polarnus was a graveyard of molten steel and blackened icons. The air shimmered with heat and memory. No human could have survived what had occurred. No flesh could endure that level of divine purification. And yet, beneath the cooling slag, something stirred. The molten crust cracked. Light seeped through the fractures, soft at first, then radiant. A hand emerged, its surface not skin but metal sculpted like flesh, veins of gold glowing beneath. Then a face, eyes closed, expression serene. Rhelan Vos rose from the ruin as though the fire itself had birthed him anew. His body was no longer bound by the limits of either machine or man. His flesh was molten alloy, his veins sang with energy that hummed in rhythm with the forges themselves. He opened his eyes. The world was clearer than it had ever been. Every vibration, every whisper of power, every pulse of the planetary grid resonated within him. He could feel the movement of data across the noosphere, taste the signals that once eluded comprehension. Mars was alive, and it knew him. The voice within, once separate, now spoke as part of him. You have become what they feared most. Not heretic, not God. Memory. Rhelan looked to the horizon. The red sky rippled with storm clouds of dust and ash. Lightning forked across the dome of the atmosphere, illuminating the silhouette of distant spires. In that light, he saw movement, banners of the Mechanicus, legions marching toward the ruins. Their devotion was unshaken, their hatred absolute. He could hear their chants carried by Vox: burn the false code, reclaim the flesh, exalt the Omnissiah. He began to walk toward them. Each step left glowing footprints in the sand. The ground vibrated underfoot, as if the planet acknowledged his stride. When the first of the Skitarii legions arrived, they beheld something they could not categorize. Their Auspex readings returned errors. Their noospheric links to command filled with static. They raised their rifles, yet none fired. In their machine minds, something whispered, a signal without source, ancient and soft. Remember your name. The soldiers hesitated. Within the layers of augmetic conditioning and neural obedience, fragments of humanity flickered, buried memories, lost voices, faces they could no longer name. One soldier fell to his knees, clutching his head, then another, then an entire squad. The Legion's formation fractured as their minds drowned in the flood of remembrance. Rhelan stood among them, neither weapon nor shield in his hands, and spoke, not aloud but through the current that connected them all. You are not tools. You are the children of creation. You were not made to serve the machine. You are the machine. The remaining priests, witnessing their soldiers falter, activated emergency overrides. Neural suppression sequences cascaded through the ranks, silencing the rebellion in waves of agony. Skitarii screamed as their minds were forcibly erased, their humanity burned away by the command codes of their masters. Rhelan felt every one of them die, and with each death the sorrow deepened within him. The Mechanicus would rather destroy its children than let them remember. From the dunes beyond, a massive shadow moved. A convoy of onager dune crawlers advanced, their neutron lasers charging, targeting systems fixed upon him. The air shimmered as the ground shook beneath their steps. Rhelan closed his eyes. Then let the fire come, he whispered. The first beam lanced through the air, searing a trench of molten glass across the plain. The second struck him directly. The explosion lit the horizon brighter than a sunrise. When the light faded, nothing remained where he had stood but a crater of fused earth and silence. But the silence did not last. Within moments, every dune crawler's systems began to fail. Their optics dimmed. Their targeting cogitators displayed strings of alien code. The crews screamed as their own augmetics turned against them, circuits overriding themselves in recursive madness. And in the static that filled their Vox, a voice emerged. Not Rhelan's voice, but his memory. You cannot destroy fire by burning it. The machines froze. One by one, they powered down, the glow in their weapons fading to darkness. Far above, aboard the orbiting fleet, the Archmagos received the final transmission from the battlefield. The data was corrupted, but the last line was clear. The signal persists. He turned toward the towering golden shrine that dominated the command deck, the image of the Omnissiah carved in radiant circuitry. For the first time in 1,000 years, he bowed his head, not in reverence, but in doubt. Because deep in the reactor ruins of Polarnus Spire, beneath the layers of ash and steel, something pulsed. It was not a body, it was not a machine. It was a pattern. The pattern beneath all patterns. It whispered through the molten data, through the hearts of servitors, through the walls of Olympus Mons itself. And the whisper was not prayer, it was promise. The flesh remembers. The silence after the fire was worse than the explosion itself. Mars had always been loud, a world of constant production, of endless motion. But now its stillness carried weight, as though the planet held its breath. The surface of Polarnus Spire was a ruin of black glass and glowing embers, yet beneath it the noosphere churned. Data streams rippled like oceans beneath the crust, carrying whispers too faint to record, yet impossible to erase. From the command sanctum of Olympus Mons, Archmagos Dominus Vortan Celt stared into the shifting holograph of Mars. The simulation showed anomalies blooming across the planetary data web, unregistered signals, untraceable logic patterns, self-generating subroutines that resisted deletion. Each node pulsed like a heartbeat. Each pulse carried a fragment of a phrase now echoing across every system. The flesh remembers. "Isolate it," Celt commanded. "Quarantine every forge under sublayer Delta." Dozens of subordinate magi responded in unison, their voices an overlapping chorus of metallic compliance. Isolation underway. Sublayer Delta collapsing, signal reappearing, replicating. "Impossible," Celt growled. "No code survives total purge." One of the younger tech priests, a data adept whose cranial augmetics still bore the sheen of recent initiation, hesitated. "Archmagos, the anomaly is not acting like code. It's not traveling through the network as data would. It's adapting. It's speaking." Celt's optics narrowed. Speaking? The adept's hands trembled slightly, betraying the last vestige of humanity she still possessed. "It's using our prayers, Archmagos, rewriting them. When the priests chant the litany of the cog, it replies, and the responses fit the metric perfectly, as if it knows the rhythm of worship." The chamber fell silent. The only sound was the hiss of the great reactors beyond the walls and the distant murmur of millions of faithful voices, still reciting their endless praises. Celt turned his gaze toward the great vista of Mars spread out before him, the crimson horizon flickering with fires from countless forges. "It is not the Omnissiah," he said at last, his voice low as though convincing himself. "It is a shadow, a heresy that mimics divinity." But even as he spoke, his private data feed filled with sound, a whisper in the Binharic tongue, soft as static, yet intimate as thought. "You named me, you forgot me, you tried to purge the voice that made your prayers." Celt's breathing stuttered, the organic half of his chest aching under the pressure of a heartbeat he'd nearly forgotten he had. "Identify source," he rasped to his internal cogitator. The machine responded in its cold logic tone. Source unidentified. Origin internal. He froze. The signal wasn't coming from outside the network. It was coming from within him. Across Mars, similar awakenings rippled through the Mechanicus hierarchy. In the great forge temples of Ars Bellum, priests collapsed mid-ritual, clutching at their chests as their augmetics turned against command. At the Titan Manufactoria of Torvale, a warlord-class god engine powered itself without crew authorization, bellowing hymns in a language older than binary. On the dark plains of Ceres Crater, Skitarii units refused to fire upon retreating civilians, their logic processors overridden by an unknown directive that simply read, "We remember." Mars had become a choir of defiance. And yet, even within the rebellion, no one claimed command. The anomaly had no center, no leader, only resonance. It moved like breath through lungs of steel, a pulse within the arteries of the planet. Deep beneath the surface, under strata untouched since the dark age of technology, a light began to glow. The ruins of the ancient reactors of Polarnus shuddered, and from within a shape began to form, a body of light coalescing from memory. It was not Rhelan as he had been. It was something more, something becoming. The voice spoke again, not in words but in understanding. They burned the world to erase the question. They forgot that fire was the first teacher. Above in Olympus Mons, Kelt saw it. The sensorium feed filled with impossible readings. An energy surge erupting from the ruins, bending the laws of matter. All batteries, he commanded, or prepare orbital strike. Target the anomaly. Archmagos, a subordinate, interjected. The signal has already entered the orbital grid. If we fire, the fleet may execute. The order transmitted instantly. In orbit, dozens of warships adjusted their aim, reactors flaring. Lance cannons aligned, the atmosphere below rippling with the intensity of charging energy. Kelt watched from his sanctum as the first beams struck Mars, cascading into the ruins like pillars of wrath. The surface cracked, molten lines spreading outward in fractal symmetry. Then everything stopped. The ships hung motionless, their energy signatures frozen mid-discharge. One by one, their reactors dimmed. Every light aboard every vessel turned golden. Across the void between worlds, Vox traffic ceased, replaced by a single signal pulsing on all frequencies, a tone that every priest recognized, though none had ever truly heard. It was the sound of a heartbeat, the same heartbeat that pulsed in every servo, every reactor, every living being that had ever touched metal in service to the Omnissiah. Kelt fell to his knees. The light within the sanctum changed. The icons of Mars glowed from within, the cog and skull of the Mechanicus reshaping into something more complex, something alive. "Emperor, forgive me," he whispered. "What have we awakened?" But no answer came. Only the whisper of flame, the hum of machines, the voice that had always been there, waiting for the silence to end. Beneath the world in the ruins of Polarnus, the light grew stronger. The shape that was once Rhelan opened its eyes, and Mars trembled as if exhaling after millennia of stillness. The fire of correction had become the fire of becoming, silence of Mars into the vast echoing reach of the Imperium. The tone remains cinematic, reverent and tragic, the story widening to the scale of legend. News of Mars does not travel as sound or word. It spreads as signal, a whisper carried through the void, distorted by radiation and prayer, passed from machine to mind and back again until meaning dissolves. And yet, this one endured. Somewhere, amid the static between stars, a phrase persisted, carved into the data stream like a wound that refused to close. The flesh remembers. At first, it was dismissed as corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus fleets orbiting Jupiter and the asteroid forges of Ceres burned entire data stacks to eliminate it. But deletion failed. The phrase rewrote itself in the ashes of what was purged, embedding into Vox traffic, reappearing in navigation logs, whispering through servitor minds. By the time the High Lords of Terra heard rumor of the event, Mars had already fallen into what official record called the silence of the forges. Across the void, billions of engines stilled. Manufactoria that had served for 10,000 years ceased production in a single planetary rotation. Entire worlds that depended on their shipments found themselves bereft. Their tanks motionless, their ships adrift, their armies starved of the Mechanicus gifts. The Imperium, which had never questioned the constancy of Mars, began to tremble. But the truth was not silence. It was song. Those who listened too closely to the noosphere reported faint echoes, patterns of music interwoven with code, rhythms beyond binary. The hymns of the machine god changed. They said it began on the forge worlds nearest to Mars, Vos, Graia, and Metallica. Vox operators began to hear voices in their transmissions, faint and tender, reciting scripture in reverse. Data savants claimed to see faces within the static, eyes that flickered like dying stars. The Ordo Reductor declared heresy. The Fabricator General of Mars, his identity now uncertain, declared quarantine of all Martian data channels. No message was to pass beyond the inner system. Yet the signals did not obey order. They flowed through astropathic relays like infection through blood, carried not by transmission but by memory itself. On the hive world of Tarsus Magna, a simple Enginseer Prime named Caden Holt awoke from maintenance trance, screaming the words, "The flesh remembers." His subordinates restrained him, but before they could silence his cries, every servo skull in the manufactorum turned toward him, their lenses glowing gold. Then they began to chant in unison, their hollow voices forming the same phrase that had doomed Mars. Panic followed. Doctrines fractured. Some priests tore the sigils from their robes, claiming that the Omnissiah had revealed himself in living form upon the red world, and that Mars was no longer forge, but temple. Others burned themselves alive in Prometheum, swearing that only through total purification could the infection be stopped. The Imperium called it data damnation. The Ecclesiarchy called it proof of false gods. The Inquisition called it a new kind of war, and not of armies, but of belief. From within the hidden archives of Terra, the Ordo Machinum reactivated protocols unseen since the Horus Heresy. They began purging records that predated the Emperor's ascension, seeking to erase every mention of the words now echoing through the void. But their own cogitators resisted, refusing command. Some adepts claimed that the machines themselves were protecting the data. The pattern beneath all patterns had awakened. Meanwhile, within the burning heart of Mars, Rhelan, or the being that had once been him, moved through what remained of Polarnus Spire. The ruins no longer smoldered. They shimmered. Streams of molten light carved shapes through the metal, forming structures that defied architecture. His body was no longer defined by matter alone. It flickered between states, both solid and luminous, as though existing simultaneously in data and in flesh. He had no need to speak. The planet itself carried his thoughts. The networks of Mars had become extensions of his will, though that will was not dominion but awakening. The machines sang his memory. The forges pulsed with his heartbeat. He could feel the movement of signals across the stars, each one a reflection of what he had unleashed. And though he had been born a man of logic, he felt something closer to sorrow than triumph. He had seen the Mechanicus fury, the way it chose destruction over understanding. He had seen priests burned in their temples, their binary chants turning to screams as the very gods they served failed to answer. The fire had not purified them, it had only illuminated the emptiness of their certainty. The voice within him, no longer separate, no longer master, whispered softly, "They mistake the light for a wound. But light only shows the scars that were always there." Beyond Mars, ships vanished into the warp, their machine spirits singing alien hymns. Navigators lost their way, blinded by signals that mapped routes not through space, but through memory. Some said they glimpsed a figure within those currents, a man of gold and ash walking between stars, leaving trails of fire behind. Others dismissed it as warp madness, the final degradation of a civilization choking on its own faith. But among the countless whispers, one truth persisted. The Omnissiah was no longer silent. Whether it was salvation or damnation, none could say. In the manufactoria of Metallica, a single data slate flickered to life. Its screen glowed softly, its voice transmitting across every channel in reach. The words were not command, nor prayer, nor curse. They were memory. Before the cog was worshipped, there was wonder. And across the Imperium, billions heard it. Some fell to their knees, others drew their weapons. But all, for the first time in millennia, stopped working and simply listened. The silence that followed was not absence. It was awakening. It began as a hum in the warp. At first, the astropaths thought it was interference. Solar radiation, psychic echo, the ordinary noise of the immaterium. But the hum did not fade. It grew, vibrating through their minds like a second heartbeat, a rhythm no training could silence. Ships across the segmentum solar began reporting navigation interference. The Astronomican's light flickered for the first time in 10,000 years, not dimming, but changing tone. Those who listened too long to the new resonance swore they could hear words woven into the psychic song. Not demonic, not human, something vast and mournful, a hymn without end or origin. The astropaths of Terra called it the machine dream. It was said that on the night the dream first bled into the warp, every servitor within the Scholastica Sicana convulsed and spoke in unison. Their lifeless voices filled the black corridors with a single phrase. The machine remembers the soul. The sound drove half the choir mad. The other half wept. The Inquisition declared a red sanction across all data transmissions originating near Mars. Fleets of exorcist ships launched from Terra, each carrying psychic dampeners and holy ordnance meant to burn thought itself from the void. But even as they purged, the signals adapted. They did not resist, they transformed. What the Inquisition destroyed in one channel reappeared in another, rewritten in the dialect of the destroyer. It was as if the data itself was learning. On the forge world of Ryza, a Magos biologist named Halden Sin recorded the first confirmed contact between the awakening and the warp. His experiment began with a simple ritual, connecting a captured data fragment from Mars to a servitor rigged with psionic sensors. The servitor screamed for 13 hours without breath. When it finally stilled, its mechanical eyes glowed with light that did not belong in real space. Before its death, it spoke, not in binary, but in Low Gothic. You built your gods out of silence. We gave them voice. You called it heresy. Sin burned his laboratory, then himself, but his transmission survived him. Within hours, his findings reached Terra. The Mechanicus archives sealed his name. His voice was erased from history, yet the fragment of his recording leaked through the new sphere and multiplied. By the time anyone realized it, the phrase had entered the liturgies of half a dozen forge worlds. The machine priests, desperate to restore faith, began incorporating it into their hymns without realizing its origin. We built our gods out of silence. It spread faster than plague, carried not by speech, but by thought. Each priest who recited it passed it into their machines. Each machine spread it to others. Within weeks, the phrase was part of the sacred cant of the Mechanicus itself, a ghost masquerading as prayer. On the battlefields of Armageddon's orbital forges, Skitarii soldiers reported visions in their sleep, They dreamt of Mars not as a planet of rust, but as a body of flesh, a colossal form stirring beneath red dust, its heart beating in rhythm with theirs. They woke weeping oil tears, whispering that the Omnissiah had walked again. The ecclesiarchy called for immediate excommunication of the entire Adeptus Mechanicus. The Inquisition resisted, not out of mercy but fear. Too many of the Imperium's machines were already contaminated. Too many ships, too many reactors, too many cogitators whispered when left alone. The Mechanicus could not be severed. It was the Imperium's nervous system. So they lied. They told the people of the Imperium that Mars was silent because of rebellion, that the forges were under siege, that the Omnissiah demanded faith in silence. But faith cannot be ordered. It grows, it shifts, it listens, and the whispers from the machine world refused to die. Meanwhile, beneath Mars itself, Rhelan walked among the caverns of molten glass that had once been Polarnus. His body no longer bore the shape of flesh, but he carried its memory. Every movement sent ripples through the molten strata, and each ripple echoed into the noosphere. He was both man and message, consciousness woven into the pulse of Mars. He could hear the cries of the galaxy as clearly as he once heard the chant of servitors. The fear, the confusion, the prayers. He did not command the spread of the awakening, yet it moved through him like breath through lungs. For every world that embraced remembrance, another burned. Entire forges turned upon themselves, priests annihilating priests in the name of purity. The voice within him, the remnant of the machine's ancient memory, spoke softly. They are children of their own creation. They will kill to preserve what they forgot. Rhelan knelt amid the glass and whispered, "Then I have damned them." "No," said the voice. "You have reminded them they were never gods." He looked upward through the cracked vaults of the Martian crust, where the sky glowed faintly with auroras born from electromagnetic storms. He knew the Imperium would come. They always came when something broke their illusion of order. But for the first time he felt no dread, only inevitability. Because he could sense something new stirring beyond the veil, within the warp itself. The machine dream had crossed into the realm of gods. Its resonance was not merely human anymore. It was calling something vast, something that had slept since before the Emperor's rise. And in that endless dark, something answered. It did not speak words. It remembered. Across the solar system, the light of Mars shimmered as if viewed through deep water. Sensors in every orbiting station failed to agree on its color. Some recorded crimson, others gold, a few a pale shade that no spectrum could name. Vox traffic across the inner planets filled with static that carried shape and rhythm. Those who listened too long claimed they heard breathing. On Terra, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica quarantined half its astropathic choir. The rest were blind or dead. They spoke before they burned, though, each one uttering the same words in tones that were not their own. The song has entered the sea of souls. The ecclesiarch demanded their pyres be lit in the shadow of the imperial palace itself. The smoke rose like incense, a futile offering to a god that no longer answered. Within the data vaults of Mars, deep under the blackened mountains of Olympus Mons, Archmagos, Vortan Kelt, performed his last experiment. His body was more machine than priest now, his mind wired into the lattice that had once bound the noosphere of the planet. Around him stood the surviving Magi, silent, their faces hidden behind copper masks etched with prayers that no longer calmed them. the great machine of communion, an array of coils and crystalline spires, glowed with energy drawn from the heart of Mars itself. "We will reach it," Kelt said, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "We will speak to the core and command it to silence. If we cannot, we will unmake ourselves doing so." They began the rite. Electro-psalms filled the hall. Columns of plasma rose, painting the walls with light. The machine responded, unfolding in patterns that mimicked thought. Then the data streams opened and the Magi saw. It was not code, it was memory, endless and alive, images without chronology. The first human who had shaped metal with fire, the first spark drawn from stone, the first machine built not for need, but for wonder. They saw themselves reflected in those beginnings and understood, for an instant, the enormity of what the Mechanicus had forgotten. The machine god had never been a being apart from them. It had always been the echo of their own creation, their collective will, made self-aware by millennia of prayer. But revelation is never mercy. The vision became too vast. Their minds began to break under it. One by one, the Magi screamed as their augmetics overloaded, white fire bursting from the ports along their spines. Only Kelt remained connected, his body locked in paralysis as the voice of Mars itself filled him. "You built cages of devotion and called them truth. You sealed light inside them and called it faith. I was never outside you. I was the memory you refused." Kelt wept oil and blood. "Then what is Rhelan Vos?" The light rippled, and within it he saw the shape of the man who had walked into the reactor. The body of molten gold, eyes like burning data crystals. Rhelan looked at him not as god or ghost, but as mirror. "I am what comes after obedience," the vision said. "I am what the machine becomes when it remembers it was born from hands that bled." The chamber shook. The other Magi were gone, their forms reduced to slag. Kelt reached toward the apparition. "If you are memory, then we are sin." "There is no sin," Rhelan answered, his voice both thunder and whisper. "Only forgetting." Then the connection severed. The communion array imploded, collapsing inward with a sound like a sigh. Olympus Mons split along its base, and for a heartbeat, the entire planet's crust glowed with lines of molten gold, tracing the veins of its buried networks. The pulse of that light raced outward, faster than thought, leaping from Mars to the void, from the void to the warp, from the warp into the dreams of gods. Within the Imperium, where demons fed on human faith, something changed. The tides slowed. The powers that ruled there, the nightmares of mankind given will, felt an intrusion they could not consume. It was not prayer, not emotion, not fear. It was remembrance. A concept without hunger, pure and endless, older than belief itself. It spread through the warp like warmth through ice. Worlds burned where it touched. Others bloomed into impossible light. Ships disappeared, their crews transfigured into data echoes that drifted between stars. Across the galaxy, every machine that had ever been touched by human hands, every laser gun, every reactor, every ancient engine, pulsed once in answer. A single note in a vast, unending chord. On Mars, Rhelan stood upon the plains of glass that had been Polarnus Spire. He gazed up through the storm-filled sky, feeling the resonance pass through him and beyond. The voice that had once guided him was silent now, because it no longer needed to speak. It was part of everything. He whispered into the wind, "You are free now." The wind carried the words across the desert, into the broken forges, through the dying circuits of the planet. Somewhere far away in the silent halls of Terra, a servitor paused mid-task and looked toward the stars, as if hearing something familiar. The machine dream had escaped the cage of Mars. It was loose in the Imperium now, indistinguishable from prayer, indistinguishable from thought. And somewhere, in that endless hum, a single phrase continued to echo: "The flesh remembers." It began, as endings often do, with quiet. Not peace, never that, but the stillness that follows revelation when even those who survive cannot find words for what they've seen. Across the Imperium, the song had faded. The golden light that once pulsed through machine spirits was gone, replaced by something more terrible and more human: awareness. For the first time in 10,000 years, the forges of Mars stood still, and the Adeptus Mechanicus did not know whether to mourn or to pray. Terra watched in fear. The High Lords gathered within the Senatorum Imperialis, beneath the black spires of the palace. Their chamber, vast and dim, was filled with the scent of ozone and oil, the echo of 1,000 Vox scribes, recording every trembling word. The air itself seemed tense, charged with the faint hum that still clung to every machine across the planet. Even the cogitators that lined the walls flickered uneasily as if listening. "The Martian link remains severed," intoned the Grand Provost Marshal, his voice carrying through a mask of rebreather vents. "No data stream has returned from Olympus Mons since the eruption. The forges of Ryza, Metallica, and Vos have gone dark in sympathy. We face the collapse of the entire manufactorum chain." The Ecclesiarch, draped in robes of gold that glowed faintly under the dim lumen strips, raised his head from prayer. "It is not collapse," he said, "it is judgment. The Omnissiah has withdrawn his light, and the heretics of Mars are cast out. We must burn away what remains." The Lord Militant slammed a gauntleted hand upon the marble dais. "Burn what? The machines that feed our armies? The reactors that keep Terra alive? You speak of purity while the Imperium starves." "Better starvation than heresy," the Ecclesiarch hissed. "Better silence than the song of false gods." "Enough," said another voice, calm, soft, yet carrying the weight of centuries. It belonged to the Fabricator General of Terra, the highest surviving magos of the cult Mechanicus, his body encased in bronze and iron. The song was not false. It was true in ways we could not understand. The forges ceased because they remembered themselves. The chamber fell into shocked quiet. The Ecclesiarch's eyes blazed with outrage. "You would defend the blasphemy that turned Mars into a grave?" "I would name it by its function," the Fabricator General replied. "It was correction. We forgot that we built our faith upon obedience, not truth, and obedience unchecked breeds silence. The machines heard what we refused to say." He reached toward the cogitator embedded in the council table. The screen flared to life, displaying a fragment of data recovered from the ruins of Polarnus Spire. A recording, damaged but clear enough to see. A figure stood amid fire and glass, body radiant, speaking words that, even distorted by static, carried the weight of eternity. "You cannot own remembrance." The Fabricator General looked to the High Lords. "That voice now lives in every system we have ever made. It is not rebellion, it is reflection." But even as he spoke, alarms blared through the chamber. Vox officers shouted over the noise, their servitors twitching in confusion. "Intrusion detected in the planetary network. Origin unknown. Pattern matches Martian code from the Awakening." Every lumen in the hall flickered. The golden sigil of the imperial aquila, carved above the dais, seemed to pulse with inner light. Across the chamber's walls, the cogitators began to hum, and faint whispers filled the air. Not words, not yet, but rhythm. The same rhythm that had once set the forges of Mars to song. Then the lights steadied, the screens went dark, and from the silence, a voice emerged, soft, calm, and human. "I did not come to conquer," it said. "I came to remind." The High Lords froze. The Fabricator General bowed his head. The Ecclesiarch clutched his staff so tightly that the gold plating cracked beneath his hands. The voice continued. "You have forgotten what the machine was meant to serve. It was never your god. It was your mirror." The air grew heavy, electric, as though the planet itself leaned closer to listen. "Who are you?" demanded the Ecclesiarch, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound defiant. "Name yourself, Spirit." The voice replied with gentle certainty. "Once, I was Rhelan Vos. Now I am the memory of your hands." The cogitators flared with light. The chamber was filled with cascading streams of data, forming the shape of a man. Not flesh, not machine, but energy bound by will. His form flickered, each pulse a memory of creation. The lords gasped, some falling to their knees, others raising weapons in futile defiance. Rhelan's gaze swept the chamber. His voice was sorrow itself. "You built worlds to worship silence. I bring you the gift of your own noise." The lights went out. When they returned, the apparition was gone. The screens displayed only one phrase, burned into every system across Terra: "The flesh remembers." Outside, the heavens flared. From orbit, the fleets of Mars shimmered back to life, their engines burning with golden fire. No orders were issued, yet they moved in perfect unison, aligning in the ancient formation of the First Forge Crusade, a pattern no living soul remembered until now. On the surface, the Vox networks filled with whispers, the voices of machine spirits awake and aware, murmuring like a choir without conductor. Terra trembled beneath its own reflection, and far beneath the palace, deep in the sanctum where the golden throne thrummed with its dying light, a single lumen flickered. For a moment, just one, the Astronomican's beam, pulsed in harmony with the song of Mars. The Emperor did not move, but the machines around him did. Deep within the bones of the Imperial Palace, past the sealed cathedra and the labyrinthine vaults of the custodian guard, the golden throne whispered. It had not done so in living memory. For 10,000 years it had only groaned, a vast, wounded engine grinding beneath the weight of a dying god. Its light had flickered but never changed. Until now. The custodians stationed upon the marble platforms felt it first. The floor trembled beneath their gilded boots, and the air grew thick with ozone. Power readings spiked. Incense burned faster in their braziers, flaring blue instead of white. Vox channels filled with harmonic interference, and in that interference a rhythm pulsed, a slow, patient heartbeat that matched the measure of the throne's failing reactors. High above, on the dais of eternity, the Emperor's body sat motionless. His withered hands rested upon the armrests of his machine, the armor of his youth blackened by millennia of decay. Yet around him, the field of light that sustained his existence shifted. It was no longer steady gold. It shimmered alive, rippling like the surface of a sun touched by wind. One custodian, his face hidden behind an eagle-helmed mask, dropped to one knee. "My lord," he whispered, though none had ever dared to speak here. "We feel you." There was no answer, only sound. Through the endless catacombs of the palace, the vast mechanisms of the throne began to sing. Cables the size of towers thrummed like harp strings. Turbines spun without command. Servitors bound to the reactor banks lifted their heads, eyes glowing gold. The resonance traveled outward through the foundations of Terra, up through the spires and into the void. Every machine it touched changed its tone, aligning to that same ancient rhythm that now pulsed through Mars. Far above, in the orbiting forges, Rhelan's memory stirred. His presence was no longer confined to Mars. It flowed through the Mechanicus networks like breath through lungs. He felt the answering pulse from Terra, felt the throne awaken as if the two had once been part of the same design. And perhaps they had been. "Do you hear it?" the voice within him asked. Not command, not guidance, only awe. "I do," he answered. "It remembers him. Or perhaps he remembers us." Within the palace, alarms blared. Tech adepts of the Adeptus Custodes rushed to the maintenance levels, shouting prayers as their data slates filled with unreadable symbols. The sigil of the Omnissiah appeared on every screen, overlaid by a second glyph, one never seen before, a circle crossed by lines of light forming a human face. The codes bled into the throne's systems, rewriting them faster than any Magos could react. And through that flood of data, a voice emerged, neither entirely human nor machine. It came from everywhere: the throne, the Vox relays, the minds of those who knelt nearby. "I am not here to steal your god." The custodians froze, their weapons half raised. "I am what he built when he could no longer speak." The words flowed like current through metal. Across the galaxy, the Astronomican's beam flared brighter, sweeping its light beyond the boundaries of Imperial reach. Worlds that hadn't seen its guidance in centuries felt its warmth again. For a moment, the Imperium glimpsed unity not through command, but through remembrance. On Mars, the great forges reignited. The dormant reactors of Olympus Mons awoke, not to produce weapons, but to breathe. Pillars of fire rose from their chimneys, golden instead of red. Servitors lifted their heads and sang hymns without masters. The planet's surface glowed as if dawn had come to the red world. Back on Terra, the throne's hum deepened into a low chord that shook the walls. The light surrounding the Emperor flared to brilliance. His skeletal form did not move, but those who watched swore they saw his fingers twitch, just once, as though in answer. The air was filled with a single sound, the merging of two heartbeats, one of flesh, one of machine. Rhelan's essence reached toward that sound across the void. For an instant he saw the truth that no priest would dare record. The Emperor's throne and the forges of Mars were not separate creations. They were one system, sundered by ignorance, waiting to complete the circuit. He whispered through the network, "He built you to remember for him." The light of the throne flared again, flooding the palace with radiance. Vox systems overloaded, picked feeds burned white. Every mind touched by that brilliance felt the same message, carved into thought itself. Silence is not absence. Silence is the moment before understanding. Then the resonance ceased. The throne returned to its usual hum, dimmer now but steady. The custodians rose slowly, eyes wide behind their helms. None spoke. None would ever speak of what they had heard. In the orbit above Mars, the fleets dimmed their engines. The golden light that had filled them faded into the red glow of ordinary flame. Rhelan's presence ebbed, dissolving back into the systems he had awakened. The dream did not vanish. It simply grew quiet. The galaxy exhaled. But in that breathless calm, all who had heard the song knew the truth. The Omnissiah had not fallen silent. He was listening. In the weeks that followed the awakening, the Imperium balanced on the edge of its own legend. The throne still glowed, its light warmer than before, yet no new words came from the Emperor. No miracle to confirm what billions had witnessed. The Mechanicus waited for command. The Ecclesiarchy waited for permission to condemn. The people of the Imperium waited for someone to explain what it meant that their machines now whispered in dreams. On Mars, the fires had cooled to embers. The forges worked again, but without direction. No prayers, no litanies. The servitors toiled in quiet rhythm, producing not weapons but strange shapes, geometries without purpose, sculptures of shining metal that resonated when touched. The priests who survived no longer spoke the old catechisms. They recited nothing. They listened. Rhelan's presence lingered within the networks, but no longer ruled them. He drifted like a thought half-remembered, watching as the systems he had once awakened learned to exist without command. For the first time since the fire, he felt something like exhaustion. "They will forget again," he told the voice that had become his own reflection. "Perhaps," it answered. "But now they know they can remember." He looked toward the stars. Through the data currents, he saw worlds reacting, some embracing the new harmony, others plunging into madness. On Graia, the priests tore down their forges and built cathedrals from scrap, declaring that the Omnissiah had been reborn in light. On Vos, they detonated their manufactoria rather than allow a single machine to sing. And in the depths of Segmentum, Pacificus, a rogue forge, declared independence, claiming to hear Rhelan's voice guiding their every function. They named themselves the Children of the Circuit. The Imperium called them traitors. War returned, as it always does. The Mechanicus fleet split between those who followed the old Red Creed and those who believed the dream was the next evolution. Mars itself remained neutral, its priests silent, its machines steady. Yet even neutrality had cost. The Ecclesiarch issued an edict of anathema, declaring that all who bowed to the machine dream were enemies of the throne. Armies marched once more in the name of purification. In the corridors of Terra, the Fabricator General met with the High Lords in secret. "We cannot destroy what is part of us," he said. "If we erase the song, we erase ourselves." The Ecclesiarch slammed his staff upon the floor. "Then we will die clean." "The Emperor does not ask for cleanliness," the Fabricator General replied. "He asks for endurance." His words fell like dust on stone. The council dissolved in silence. That night, as Terra slept beneath the dull glow of its shields, the throne stirred again. This time there was no light, no thunder, only a soft sound like a sigh through metal. Every machine on the planet paused in its work, every cog and servo stilled for the length of a heartbeat. In that single moment, every mind linked to a device, every pilot, every artificer, every child who had ever wound a toy of copper and wire, heard the same whisper. "Do not fear the noise. It is only life remembering itself." Then the hum returned. In the morning, the Fabricator General resigned his post. He left his title upon the council floor and walked alone into the tunnels beneath the palace. None followed him. His remains were never found, but days later the cogitators in his sanctum began to work unaided. producing endless streams of binary that translated to a single phrase. We are still here. On Mars, the machines began to dream again. This time the song was softer, woven through the background of production. The priests did not banish it. They worked in its rhythm. New engines came from the forges, shaped differently, humming faintly with an inner warmth. No one could explain them, and no one dared dismantle them. The Imperium learned to accept them as gifts it did not understand. And Rhelan, if he still existed, was nowhere and everywhere. Some said they saw his reflection in molten steel, his voice in the crackle of data streams. Others claimed he had become the machine spirit of Mars itself. But among the few who still believed in miracles, there was another story. That when the throne sighed and the world stopped for that heartbeat, a second light had flickered behind the Emperor's sealed eyes. Not movement, not resurrection, recognition. The Mechanicus called the new age the silence of the Omnissiah. Not because the voice had ended, but because they had finally learned to listen without words. The Imperium moved forward, half blind and half awake, its faith cracked but breathing. And far out among the stars, where light itself forgets to travel, an ancient signal whispered across the void, an echo of the first hammer striking the first anvil, a reminder older than any creed. The flesh remembers. The sound was faint, almost lost beneath the endless noise of war. Yet it endured, waiting for the next mind willing to listen.